live meeting of Battle of Homestead in 2.5 years. And welcome to the historic pump house, a sacred place for all of us. And just to point out the banners on the windows, they serve the purpose of darkening the room for some of our visuals today. We don't mean to block out all the air. We know it's a little humid, but we love these banners. They were developed, painted, devised by longtime member Bill Yunt, who was the communication director of the Insulators Union. I see we have some union friends here today. Now, former union official at Clairton, Rose Beasy, and her husband John. Where's Rose? Over there. Hi, Rose. Welcome aboard. We have a retired staff person from the United States Steelworkers. How many years, Bill? Bill Eatman? 44 years as a steelworker. He retired right before COVID. We have Kelly Barrett, who's chair of the women's. Say it again. Former chair of the women's caucus of Women in Steel from Steelworkers and working at Irwin Works, right? Welcome aboard. I know I'm missing some. What other unionists here can?
Unions represented.
All right. Oh, we have John, the business agent of the co-op, and among many things. What do we don't call them business agents anymore? Okay, we just call them reps, right? And Al Hart, former staff at the UE, communications director. Former something, I think. You all welcome aboard. I know there's some others. I see some union hats and so on. How about union attorneys? Yeah? Okay, Ronnie, just you. That's the one. Okay. My name's John here. I'm about to introduce to you the one of the last people to walk out of the Homestead Mill when it was closing. And he didn't go quietly, and he took a lot with him when he came. So that's why we have an archive program that we're developing. But if you haven't heard Mike Stout speaking at a rally, you might have heard him singing the songs at a picket line. And I'm so pleased that we have Mike to help us with our entertainment and celebration and commemoration today. I give you Mike Stout, and I give you Jason Kendall, just like the catch-up for the
Thank you, John, and welcome. I want to give a warm welcome to everybody here, and just to add on, a special welcome to my fellow and sister steelworkers here, and especially my brothers from Homestead Local 1397, Cal Shookman, who was one of the first people I met in the mill, and also Jerry Fitzgibbons, who worked in. And I just want to mention too, on another subject matter, that last night the vote was 11-4 to ban fracking in Allegheny County parks. And counting our victory at Amazon in Churchill against Amazon, and counting our victory with Summerlee, this is the third time we've kicked Rich Fitzgerald down. 3 times in 1 year. In circa 2016, 2015, 2016, my wife Steph and I were on one of our winter jaunts down south, and an author and Native American named Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz came through Homestead, and Charlie McAllister told me she was coming through, and I said, oh, please get me her contact information and a signed copy of her book, and he did. And I ended up calling her and talking to her on the phone and emailing her. And then on the way back, from one of my shows in 2018 out west. Steph, who was probably the best trip planner I ever met in my life, one of the stops we made was at the St. Louis Arch. And I took her there because the steel for the St. Louis Arch was made in Homestead. And we went on the tour of the Arch, and it was really wild because the tour guy who was giving the guys said, "Yeah, like we got our steel from Pittsburgh and Homestead." Like we were going, "Yeah, it's not, you know." But anyway, when we were there, we went to this museum underneath, and there was this museum of Native American history that just totally blew me away, because the history showed everything that Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz talked about in her book, which is an indigenous people's history of the United States. It was the history of the United States from the eyes and the minds and from indigenous peoples. And it was that book and that visit that I saw, because they didn't pull any punches. They showed the genocide, the poisoning, the Trail of Tears, everything is there. It's in the St. Louis Arch. I mean, it just blew me away. So I wrote this song after going there and talking to Roxanne, and it's called "Give Back This Stolen Land." And remember, when the Battle of Homestead was going on in 1892, there was another war raging out west, and that was with the Native American Indians preserving and protecting their land and their tribes. This song goes out to them, called "Give Back This Stolen Land."
Service of the powers of the European continent. Like a wave of locusts crossing the sea, our battleships of manifest destiny. Under cover of religion, each incursion bless the sacraments. Dreams of riches, fountains of youth, twisted wishes, perversions of truth. Indigenous nations vaporized, displaced and colonized, erased by genocide. 400 broken treaties with more than 500 tribes. Bison slaughter, cannon butter, poison water, and bribes. They call them savages to justify all the ravages they couldn't deny. The history of their crimes and death lay buried in lies. Conquistadors of white supremacy, might makes right their ideology. A mortal stain on our history, atonement must be made. Restitution will be paid. On display in museum, you can see them beneath the St. Louis Arch. The early innings, the beginnings of a very long imperialist march. From the lost healing arts, buried hearts of a wounded knee. to disasters and massacres from sea to polluted sea. Trails of blood and tears, mountains of wrongs, blankets with diseases just as deadly as bombs. Milk of Mother Earth for all she's worth, and it's still going on. We'll never rectify the sins of the past till justice is the die we cast. This culture of conquest will never last. The day of reckoning we'll see indigenous peoples free. Give back this stolen land. Restore the rights of the native inhabitants. Give back this stolen land. Give Mother Earth a rebirth just as fast as we can. There will be no recovery, a new ghost and prophecy, until never epiphany we stand. And we stand on stolen land. People in stolen land. People in stolen land. This stolen land. This stolen land. Goes out to all the Native Americans and indigenous peoples. Thank you. And I want to tell you, I am privileged to play with absolutely one of the best musicians in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County, Mr. Jason Kendall. Give him a big hand. Thank you.
Thank you, Mike and Jason. Really appreciate it. Folks hadn't noticed, but we have our press table over here, and that includes our Facebook Live presentation to the thousands of followers that follow Battle of Homestead Foundation. Maura Bainbridge is handling our Facebook Live program. We hope that our members in England and Germany will be able to tune in as well today. We, during the pandemic, we had Zoom meetings, Zoom breakfasts every other week. Of course, before the pandemic, we had breakfast every week at the Eden Park in Homestead. Now we're pondering how to do both Zoom and breakfast live. I guess they call it hybrid in the schools, right? But we're so pleased to be here today, and we're so pleased that you're here today. And I don't know about you, but I love this place. It's the only building that existed today, that was here back in 1892, and frankly, before that, when the Carnegie Steel Corporation was here. And of course, today we're commemorating 130 years of the very day, July the 6th, 1892, when right outside these windows on the riverfront, 300 Pinkertons tried to land, sent here by Andrew Carnegie and his henchman, Henry Clay Frick. And this historic battle changed everything. We're going to talk about that today and give some of our personal and results of personal reading and study and discussions because it was 130 years ago, but we can still see it happening today. So I'm very pleased that we can introduce our county council person that represents, among other places in the district, Homestead. And Paul Kraus was instrumental to get Paul Klein, excuse me. Paul Kraus wrote the book, right? Yeah, the Homestead book. Sorry. Paul, you might be destined to write a book too. Paul Klein and Councilwoman Anita Frizio were central to passing this resolution, and I asked Paul to get his best dramatic voice. He's going to read us the proclamation for the Allegheny County Council.
Thank you. Thank you very much, John. Politicians, am I a politician? They like to give speeches, and I've always thought that that they must give a lot of speeches in hell, and you must have to sit through a lot of them. So I'm thinking that's a reason for living a good life. A little close, okay. So I'm thinking that that would probably be a reason to live a good, decent life. But last night we at council actually presented the proclamation to John, and it was a really important moment. And I would say that one of the things that Allegheny County Council does a great deal of is we proclaim a lot. We issue a lot of proclamations, and some of them are not terribly consequential, but they're consequential to most people. But this is one of real significance. I mean, I think we might have done one once for someone who finally passed a kidney stone, and I thought, I think that's kind of overdoing it. But this is something that really, really does matter. So I'm happy to be here today, and I would really like to thank the foundation for the work that you do. And I think that the work that you do is really preservationist work, because the foundation is the guardian, the keeper of historic memory. And it's really not just important, but vital, because if we can't understand and appreciate the past, then I think we really do lose our way. And unfortunately, we're living in a time and in a world in which that is not seemingly as important as we always thought it was. I mean, we thought history mattered. We thought it ought to be taught early on in life, and that journey ought to continue. And we just don't do it anymore. And it was Santayana who famously said, "Those who forget or who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." And if I would reframe that today, I might say that those who never really understood the past, never were taught the past, are condemned to deny it. And I think that there's a lot, maybe too much of that going on in the world that we live in today. I would also tell you this, this is important to me because I made a decision many years ago to, when I was in college, to get a degree in history. And everyone was really puzzled by that because it ensured that I would be unemployable. And that might certainly be the case. But I have to tell you something. I've never regretted that for a moment. It has made my life richer, and it gives me a sense of joy, just feeling like I have some connection to a world that I was not a part of. But it helps me better understand that world and this world today as well. So, and I'd also like to give a shout out to Rosemary Trump, who joined us last night at County Council. And one other person who joined us, who I have not seen for a while, and she's with us here today as well, and that is Joni Rabinowitz. So, so it's good to see you 2 days in a row. Never too much. So I would like to share this with you, and actually it's a pretty, as proclamations go, it's pretty well crafted, pretty well done. So let me just share this with you today. And again, this is the proc that was put together by council, and let me just kind of read this. And the light's not great, but I can get there. So this is from the Office of County Council. Whereas the Homestead Steel Strike, including the July 6, 1892 Battle of the historic pump house in Munhall, is arguably the most famous and consequential struggle in American labor history. And whereas 3,000 workers working under a union contract from 1889 to 1892, helped build and then operate what was among the most productive and revolutionary steel mills in the world, combining both Bessemer and open heart technologies. And whereas in Homestead, a town founded in 1881 to serve the needs of a rapidly expanding steel industry, several thousand townspeople and workers asserted a certain property right to their jobs and took up arms in defense of their employment. And whereas a force of 300 Pinkerton agents armed with Winchester repeating rifles, hired by Henry Clay Frick to assert the property rights of Carnegie Steel, failed in their attempt to land on the banks of the Monongahela, and following a gun battle where 7 workers and 3 Pinkerton agents were killed, they surrendered to union and town leaders. And whereas under the union contract, workers had a strong voice on the job, a negotiated share of productivity and profit, hours that were determined by work function and negotiation, Sundays and holidays off, as well as control over the political life of the town through free elections. And whereas, following the breaking of the union, the lower half of the workforce worked from 72 to 84 hours a week with drastically reduced pay, a swing shift that was also imposed that severed workers from the political life of the town, with many subjected to the brutal long term, a 24-hour shift every other week, as time off for the weekends and holidays was virtually abolished. And whereas the 1892 Battle of Homestead established the dominance of the American system of employment at will, where both collective and individual rights of workers were completely subjugated to the will of corporate power and private ownership. No power to bargain, negotiate, or even speak until the United Steelworkers gained a contract 45 years later, in 1937. Now therefore be it resolved that we, and this is Anita Pritzio and Paul Klein, and all members of Allegheny County Council, do hereby recognize July 6, 2022 as the 130th anniversary of the Battle of Homestead, and encourage citizens to discuss the importance of organized labor in reducing extreme economic inequality, to think about society's need for worker skills, intelligence, and participation to achieve a sustainable and useful employment, and to understand the centrality of both free speech and concerted activity to rebuild productive and healthy communities. In witness thereof, I have hereunto caused the seal of the County of Allegheny County to be affixed this 6th day of July, 2022.
All right.
And I hope Jeff Bezos is paying attention. Thank you very much, and thank you for all you do, and thank you for including me with that. I really appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
One question, Paul. I'm a little confused about the proclamation process. Was there any dissenting votes?
Not that I could tell, but if there were, they kept it to themselves.
They kept it to themselves.
Yes.
That's called control. That's
Thank
good.
you.
I like that.
Thank
Thank you
you.
very much. Okay, we're going to begin our marathon meeting, and we wanted this to be informal, but not so informal that people couldn't hear or participate. We're going to go for a while. I know it's hot. If people feel we need to maybe take a break, you should feel like you can get up and go to the restrooms that are in the water tower next door and come back. But we have important things, I think, to say about the meaning of July 6, 1982 here at the Pump House. And we wanted to start with kind of an overview of then up to kind of now, And who better than a historian to do that and point it out? Now, technically, we're going to have a little PowerPoint, and retired Pitt Professor Joe White, a specialist in labor history, particularly British labor history, will give us a brief rundown, and he's promised that 1 minute per slide can do it. And here he is, Joe. Welcome aboard.
Greetings, everyone. It's hard to squeeze 130 years of history into 10 minutes. So, what is the newspaper many of us have come to love to hate? They were the New York Times. Okay. As you can see, the Homestead strike was national news on the front page, even of the New York papers from day one. Okay, it remains, as Paul Klein just reminded us, the most famous industrial dispute in American labor history. Okay, it was neither the first nor the largest bloodbath in an industrial dispute in U.S. labor history. That is now the New York Times, as we know too well, was no crusading newspaper, as they say, but even the Times was shocked by what they were reporting. Finally, the workers won the battle that day, okay, but they were going to lose the war. Even the New York Times had no way of knowing this at the time. The next slide is the front page of what was one of the biggest and best Pittsburgh newspapers of the day. The paper wrote, and here I quote, "Through the strike, Homestead has attained an international name. It has been the rallying cry of all labor unions in the country." Well said, and quite true. Okay. The paper's coverage was detailed and objective. It noted the important point that other Carnegie mills, which the union had not declared to be on strike, like one at Beaver Falls, struck nevertheless in sympathy with the strikers. Okay. The Pittsburgh Dispatch did not hazard an opinion one way or the other as to the severity or otherwise of the defeat. Okay. Finally, the final takeaway I want to leave you with on the coverage of the end of the strike. I don't know what the Pittsburgh Dispatch's overall political orientation was, but its report, again, on the front page of the conference of the German Social Democratic Party, again, on page 1, was on a par with the accuracy of their Homestead reporting, something which I think we would all agree cannot be said for what remains of daily newspapers in Pittsburgh today, but that's another story. What we have here is the best and most famous book on the social and human consequences of defeat, which, as I say, found full expression in Margaret Byington's Homestead, The Families of a Mill Town. The early years of the 20th century was a golden age of social investigations. Think here of Jacob Riis's How the Other Half Lives, about New York City. For those of you who are internationally inclined, think of Charles Booth's London Life and Labor series. This genre was actually founded by a 24-year-old German fellow by the name of Frederick Engels, whose father sent him to Manchester in 1844 to tend to the family business. Engels' Condition of the Working Class in 1844 is still in print. One of the many takeaways from Byington is that it wasn't poverty per se, but the sheer refusal of anyone to take responsibility for living conditions, starting with infrastructure. When the socialists back then called for gas and water lines to be extended to working class neighborhoods, and have been sometimes reviled for their position as and were sneeringly called gas and water socialists. Nevertheless, the socialists were absolutely correct to make those demands. Okay, moving along. Back to our friend the New York Times today. Okay, we're now going to talk a bit about takeaways from the steel strike of 1919. This New York Times banner headline makes no mention of the raging civil war in revolutionary Russia, nor does it mention that the revolution had not been defeated in Germany and Italy. Massive union growth and militancy extended even to Great Britain. The steel strike of 1919, then, is best seen as this country's entry into the post-World War I revolutionary upsurge, along with general strike in Seattle and many other strikes in 1919 and 1920 in the United States. Okay. Note further that the headline leads with a race riot and lynching in Omaha, Nebraska, of all places. Who knew? Okay. There were actually many others, and this does tell us something that we are now starting to take the full measure of the history of race and racism in this country, and the fact that Afro-American people were part of the working class of this country since the year 1619. The 1919 steel strike was lost, but as William Z. Foster correctly predicted, that he predicted that an essentially similar strategy would ultimately prove victorious. Now on slightly more familiar territory. Okay, U.S. Steel recognizes the union. Okay, note that the headline writer of the New York Times assumes that readers will know what CIO stands for. Okay. Countless progressives at the time and after hoped that CIO, social unionism as it was called, would supplant AFL, business unionism. Their hopes were not completely realized, but they were far from being completely fulfilled either. Okay. U.S. Steel, going back to 1937, which recognized the union, was in those days called Big Steel. Little Steel did not yet, however, recognize the union, and as a result, it was yet another massacre in May of 1937, which time forbids us getting into more detail concerning. So that I'm going to now move on to the 1941 memorial. Sure enough, the 1941 memorial, which reads in full, erected by the members of the Steelworkers Organizing Committee in memory of the iron and steel workers who were killed in Homestead, PA on July 6, 1892 while striking against the Carnegie Steel Company in defense of American rights. Okay, this was the first monument put up to Homestead strike, so far as I know, and we'll find out during discussion with Rod about that. Okay, the monument was hard to find until recently. Today, of course, we have Google. Okay, you want to see the memorial? Go Google it. Okay, but note finally here, and most importantly, I think, how American rights is left undefined and hence is quite open-ended. Okay, do American rights include the right to bargain collectively? Why not? The right to strike? Yeah. The right to a living wage? Okay. Still more rights? Will workers' demands ever end? Why should they? I think it's this last part that drives the reaction of this crazy, and that we have to always be eternally vigilant to see that they do not prevail, but that we do. We're now fast forwarding to the strike of steel strike of 1959. Okay, I put these editorial cartoons up to show how stupid and vacuous they all are. Okay, they all are, all on the theme of earthquake on both your houses, this strike is not and can never be in the national interest, blah, blah, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, this raises the question then, so what was the strike about? Okay, the answer in short but accurate is that the strike was about the right of the bosses to unilaterally boss workers around ad lib. That's what the strike of 1959, or 116 days, was all about. The workers won. Okay. We can therefore, if we are so inclined, and I think we should be so inclined, think of 1959 as a second Battle of Homestead, okay, with a radically different outcome, because even the New York Times admitted that the workers and their union had beaten the court. We are now up to the experimental negotiating agreement of 1973, okay, which some of you probably might be even fresh in your minds. Others of you might not have even heard of it. Okay, here's what we need to take away from it. Okay, legal curbs on unions' right to strike were nothing new. Think of the Taft-Hartley law of 1947, and think of the criminalization of all strikes, which in the 19th century was quite common. Okay. What is distinctive about the experimental negotiating agreement of 1973 is that it wasn't forced upon the union, but on the contrary, both union and management should be seen as co-sponsors, if you will, of this agreement. Okay. Pittsburgh media, as you might well imagine, is fulsome in their praise for the experimental negotiating agreement, which was supposed to take effect for 4 years and really never did have never did fulfill the hopes that people had for it. Okay. The ENA's significance had everything to do also with the fact that imports now were a large and growing share of the U.S. Market, which again is terribly important. In a way, it is a coda to the experimental negotiating agreement, which is that it did not go down well for many steel workers, including the workers in the Youngstown, Ohio area, which went to court unsuccessfully, I might add, saying that, look, the membership of the union never got to vote on this thing, but we think membership should have got vote to it. Okay, they had a point, but I think we have to also recognize that if it had been put to a voice, I suspect that it would have won. But again, we'll never know. Also significant, and again, one of these things that we simply don't have time for, but we need to make time for, is that the same Youngstown, many of the same Youngstown workers who wanted a vote on what was basically a vote on the right to strike, were also furious at the fact that the union had negotiated a consent decree with the U.S. Government over the hiring and promotion of women and Afro-American workers. Okay, there was a real deep split in union ranks over the consent decree, which again, what we can do for today is to acknowledge that it existed, but can't give it Let's talk about the River Ran Red very briefly. The River Ran Red was, to my knowledge, the first documentary film, made about 1892. I'm not sure whether it's correct to call our Steffi Domike the producer of the film, but she sure did marshal all the forces of production and did a great job doing it. Next to finally And ultimately, as they say in the academic trade, we have a book by, again, our Mike Stout. Mike's book is correctly and accurately called The Last 10 Years of Homestead Work. Now, by this time, you might think, and you'd be right to think, that books and articles and what have you about Homestead are a dime a dozen, and what do we need one more for? But Mike's absolutely right to publish, to write and publish his book, because hardly any of the previous writing about steel labor was written by workers. Okay, so Mike's really does stand out in a class of its own by itself, which is why I put it on our list of takeaways, and and I urge you to read it. Okay, so that we now come to what I would like to suggest are the big takeaways that you might want, that we all might want to think about. Okay, the first is that is a negative statement that the history of the last 30 years has certainly not been an upward slanting straight line of progress. Wins occurred, but so did losses. Okay. Nor has the last 130 years taken the form of a sine curve, for those of you who remember your high school trigonometry with its regular ups and ups and downs, and you get the idea. Okay, no, that's not big. I have been depicting the history, and I don't think, well, you should be depicting the history either. Okay. And thirdly, the history of the last 130 years certainly does not suggest that things will get better by themselves. Okay. That is perhaps the most the most disabling, crippling, and it's quite stupid notion of all to think that things will get better by themselves. Okay. Finally, the cynical and quite plausible French expression that the more things change, the more things remain the same. Okay, that's quite fit even. All right, so where's this leaving us? Okay, well, I hope it leads us to is a better bottom line, which is that powerful labor unions are the best way ever invented to ensure political and economic democracy. It'd be labor obvious to say that in 2022, this is more true than ever before. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thank you so much, Joe. I want to read a brief paragraph for any of you that have tuned into our programs that we've done by Zoom, our Battle Homestead programs. You may have heard. To me, it's kind of the best statement of who the Battle of Homestead is and what we're trying to do. Let me briefly tell you about the Battle of Homestead Foundation. Our founders were inspired by the dramatic labor conflict, the 1892 Battle of Homestead. The nation's eyes back then were on this thriving industrial town, 12 miles downriver from Pittsburgh. The strong union, the amalgamated, had built powerful alliances within the workforce, the community, and the region. They knew they had to defend their labor contract and its high compensation and work standards. Their employer, the Carnegie Steel Company, was a monopoly steel coal empire controlled by Andrew Carnegie and the henchman Henry Clay Frick. And they were determined to cut the wages of the steel workers that frankly led the industry and break the union, since unfortunately the amalgamated, while strong in Homestead, was not necessarily fully organized at the other Carnegie mills in the area. When the contract expired, Frick built a 12-foot high wall and locked the workers out, 12-foot high, 3 miles long, around the mill. It was called by the workers Fort Frick. They put a wire fence on top of that wooden mill and electrified it, one of the first uses of electricity. But they also built little holes in the wall, as the Post-Gazette said, enough that someone inside could put a rifle out and shoot outside. And this was utilized on June the 30th, 1892, when Carnegie and Frick unilaterally declared, we're through with negotiations. The contract has not been settled. We will no longer recognize the union, and any worker in the mill today who wishes to come to work when we resume again must sign our contract. Not a negotiated contract, but our contract. And it's going to contain everything that we've demanded of the union in this negotiations. That's what the people and the workers of Homestead faced. They knew they had to defend their jobs. So, of course, an epic struggle ensued, which, despite extraordinary resilience and militance by the workers and their allies, ultimately resulted in defeat for the Union. It didn't seem that way at the end of the day, although it was a terrible day. I think we've heard about the gauntlet that the townspeople formed after the Pinkertons surrendered and were marched up the banks and through the streets of Homestead, I think to the Opera House where they were housed, after an agreement had been reached, brokered by the Union, that they would be permitted to be taken out of town and put on a train and taken out of town. But that was not a happy scene for the Pinkertons. They got beat up in the process, walking through town. And sometimes people focus on that and say, oh, they went too far. But imagine if you had to defend your job. What were the limits that you could go to try to defend? And it wasn't only the workers, it was their families and their townspeople. Thousands of people in town at least had the sense to realize, we're not going to murder these people. They've fought, they've lost. Now get out of town. And they got out of town. And for that week, Homestead was truly a workers' republic. It really was. What happened? 8,000 militiamen were sent by the governor, named Patterson. And those militiamen arrived about a week to 10 days, I don't know the exact date, after the Battle of Homestead. And in this peaceful town, the community had been mourning their dead. Funerals, marching down the streets to the churches. Ministers, pastors, saying they died for a just cause. But the workers felt they could not stand against 7,000 to 8,000 militia people. And the leader of the militia people, they were actually, as the workers arrived as the militia arrived on the trains, they were greeted civilly by the union members and the workers and said, help us defend our jobs. They couldn't. They couldn't. And because there were now 8,000 militia people, there could now be trainloads of scabs that could come into the town to replace the workers' jobs. And the union declared a strike. The strike lasted until union members voted that winter's coming, we better have a job. Not all of them did, it was very controversial, but that didn't happen until I think late October, November, until the strike was declared over and the bargaining was lost. So it's the details I think that a lot of people never know about. A lot of people never knew, hey, Carnegie had the power to bring in 8,000 soldiers and enforce the scab labor. And really, they had no legal rights. So, because we have studied this history, and because we've seen these seeds of hope by the townspeople, the workers, the political processes in this town, we feel it could have been different. And part of our mission in people's history is to talk and believe and show we can build upon these seeds of hope because we can create a better world. So, I'm very happy to introduce a wonderful trade unionist and leader from Pittsburgh, Sister Rosemary Trump.
Absolutely. And before we do take the time before you leave today to see the wonderful works that Mike Stout and Mark Fallon and Steffi Domike and others have donated to our archival collection, and it's a real treat. I know that John will talk more about that at the end of the program. So anyway, let me share. You are in for a treat. We have Tammy Hepps here today, and Tammy is a worldwide lecturer on genealogy and sharing how we're able to have history for families and communities, and that we can make them relevant and interesting. And she has specialized. Thank you, Tammy, for relocating from New York to Pittsburgh and Homestead to create the Homestead Hebrews wonderful website. She's a computer whiz, but most importantly, for us, she's a friend and a genealogy whiz, and she's going to be our first guest speaker. So, welcome, Tammy Hepps. All right.
I'm reminded that at the 2017 event, I think that was the first time, Rosemary, that I heard you speak, and I was just so impressed with how amazingly you spoke extemporaneously and how passionately. I am not an extemporaneous speaker, and yet that's what I'm going to attempt to do today. When all of you were so kind to invite me to speak at this event about a month ago, I thought, okay, what is it that I want to say about the Homestead strike at this moment? And I've been thinking about it here constantly, and I'm still thinking about it now. It's such a time that we're living in the present, and to locate ourselves 130 years in the past and try to forge connections that will empower us for the fights that lie ahead. It's not obvious. There's so much to say, and yet there's also silence. I thought I had a glimmer of an idea. I was in the entrance of Frick Park called Blue Slide Park. I don't know if any of you ever get up that way. And a group of anarchists, and I know that because they had tagged the park with their symbol, had blotted out the name of Frick and attempted to rename the park Berkman Park. And they graffitied on some of the benches, Berkman shot Frick, which is a fact. Not propaganda necessarily, but a fact. And so it happened to be that I was there at a potluck, and I was delighted that that gave me an excuse to tell everybody the story of the Homestead strike. I was surprised at how few people there actually knew the history. But the more that I thought about it, the more that I actually felt like the graffiti was a little ridiculous. Berkman shot Frick is a fact. Berkman was right is a statement. So if I were gonna, tag that park, maybe I would have gone more in that direction. But the fact is, Berkman shot Frick. What did that mean? Was it even good that Berkman shot Frick? Because the fact of the matter is that people living at that time actually thought that an outsider coming in with his own revolutionary ideology and attempting to insert himself into the fight here actually didn't make the fight any better. And if anything, it was one of the turning points when the people in this town lost in the court of public opinion, and where something that somebody from outside the community did became associated with the people in this community and made it harder for them at a point in which they were already losing momentum in the fight to keep up that momentum. It also seems, a little bit ridiculous to seek power in the past when, as a few people have referenced, we're backsliding in the present. There's no other way to say it. I also, not just remembering what Rosemary said in 2017, but I remember where we were at that moment early in Trump's administration to where we are 5 years later, and what feels like an intensification and an acceleration of the forces that we were all frightened about at that time, and yet still felt like there was some hope to hold back the tide. I think about even what's happened in the past 2 weeks that's made it impossible for me to transport myself into the past. The shooting in Uvalde, the repeal of concealed carry in New York by the Supreme Court, the repeal of Roe even a couple days ago, the shooting in Highland Park, which it's still very much occupying my brain as we begin to get the details of who the shooter was, the fact that he tried to get into a synagogue on Passover, the fact that a 2-year-old boy whose parents came here, were Jewish immigrants from the Soviet Union who came here seeking religious freedom, is now an orphan because both of his parents were shot at that parade. And I stand here and I remember my own great-grandfather who came here in the late 1880s and was in Homestead at the time of the strike. And I remember why it was that he came here and the rest of his Jewish community assembled here. And I think, my God, could they have imagined where it would all lead? Not just Highland Park, but of course that a member of their own Homestead Jewish community was one of the people who was murdered at Tree of Life. And so with all of that in my brain, I think, what's the point of usable history? What are we even doing? And yet we're all here because we believe in that. It's in our blood. It is what we turn to when we're trying to figure out how to live through these difficult moments in the present. I've always admired what the Battle of Homestead does, the foundation does, in using labor activism that's infused by the battles of the past and showing how this has been a continuous struggle and the struggle goes on. In my own work, I turn to Jewish history to try to empower my fellow Jews living in America to find meaning and increasingly figure out how do we navigate these difficult circumstances that we find ourselves living in as America pushes back on rights and liberty for all of its citizens. And I find that we're joined together in this sense of safety and solidarity, that the battles that have animated this group and the values that have animated my work really at the end of the day come together. And that solidarity is what we're trying to focus on here today. And so I'm reminded that we weren't always able to gather here and commemorate the Battle of Homestead. After 1892, you couldn't talk about it. You look at Homestead newspapers, they don't even reference the major anniversaries. It's too dangerous to talk about. As Margaret Byington said in her book, if you want to talk in Homestead, you have to talk to yourself. It was simply too dangerous, and really until the late 1930s when the Union began to come back, to even talk about what had happened here, let alone say that you agree with it in the spirit of 1892 is something that should animate the people of this town and should animate this country in a larger sense. So I think about 2017 and I think about where we are and I think, where are we going to be in 5 years from now? Can we gather like this? Can we speak freely like this? I can't believe I'm asking those questions, but when I look at the past 5 years, it makes me truly concerned when I look at the protests after Roe was repealed and people like me standing in the streets holding signs being beat up by the police. Is that where we're going? Is that where speech is going? Is what we're doing here going to become as dangerous in 5 years as it was in the 1890s, in the 1900s, in the 1910s, in the 1920s, for most of the 30s, for that gigantic stretch of time? And so I came here today with half an idea about what I wanted to say and thought, well, let me just stand in this spot and see what comes up. And the fact is, it seems like what's coming up for me is what came up for a lot of you. Not just what happened here on July 6th, and I do feel the ghosts of the people who were here in this building on that day, who were, there, with whatever weapons that they had that they could muster, with the women who were bringing down sandwiches because the fight lasted all day, and who knew that that would be the case when they rushed down at dawn. But I also find myself thinking about the weeks later when the militia marched in, the months later as the workers began to starve. And then, of course, after the strike ended, when the town truly was in an economic depression and most people weren't working. And the Homestead newspaper, which at one point had been the voice of the workers, had very quickly become the voice of the mill, and said, people of America, stop sending food to Homestead. No one's starving here. That wasn't the case. That was the beginning of very, very lean years for Homestead. And yet you look in the newspaper and you look at what people were saying, and that was the beginning of this kind of propaganda claiming that what was happening here wasn't what was really happening here. I found a newspaper article that was written shortly after the strike before it all turned. It was in the Homestead newspaper with a little snippet. It says, a lady writes, it remains to be seen, however, what judgment will be meted out by the unbiased chroniclers of the future to the little town on the Monongahela that has had the temerity to rise up and assert its rights if not legal while certainly moral, in the presence of mighty capital. The difference between a good deed and a bad deed, like individuals, is often dependent upon surrounding circumstances. The result, nevertheless, is what makes or adds glory or dishonor to the deed. How will it be with Homestead? And the truth is, when you look at those decades after the strike, how it will be with Homestead is that homesteaders found a way of reclaiming their voices and reclaiming the meaning of this day, and that's what we're doing here. It was people like us who began to gather again to say what happened here. And I remember when Mike Stout spoke about his book when it came out in 2020 during COVID over Zoom, and I asked him when he and his fellow labor activists were doing what they did in the 70s and the 80s to try to push back at what not only mill management but their union was doing in those waning days of the steel industry. And I said, to what degree were you connected to those events of the past? And I wrote down what he said, and I can't find it on my computer, but as he told me this morning, it's all throughout his book, that for them the spirit of 1892 was very much alive, and that it was something that they felt all around them as the successors to, if not, literally in blood, as in the toil of the work that they did and the fight that they were in. And so I think about that, and I think that's what we need to recapture here as well, that spirit of 1892. You can't help but feel it today standing here. I was surprised by how much, like I said, I felt it around me as soon as I got out of my car and walked into this building. And so I feel like that is what we need to take away from us more than anything else, because we're back in the fight. It never ended, but we're really back in the fight. And who knows what's going to happen next week, next month, next year, let alone 5 years from now when we next want to gather together like this. I hope that we can be together again like this in 5 years, but we're going to have to muster for the fight of our lives. And just like that columnist said in the Homestead newspaper, it still remains to be seen. What will be the story of Homestead? That's on all of us. Thank you.
The worker who creates the wealth. The workers create the wealth, right? So, now my joy is to introduce a great friend and the first woman and filmmaker to document what happened here on film. And that's Steffi Domike, who's a labor educator now with the United Steelworkers, a community activist, and a fighter for justice for all. Steffi!
Well, good to see everybody. We haven't seen each other for a number of years, and we're making it through. We're getting through. I was asked to talk a little bit about what we are doing, the Battle of Homestead is doing in reference to the National Endowment for the Humanities that is coming to Pittsburgh in the next 2 weeks. with groups, about 70 educators from around, high school educators from around the country, to talk about how Homestead fits into their curriculum and how they can teach about it. And I will review what a number of us will be talking about in that context, but it's also interesting and important that Homestead was never on the agenda for schools, for historians, for so many of us, many people thinking about what's going on in the country. They weren't talking about or thinking about the important labor struggles of that period, let alone today. But for the National Endowment for the Humanities to take this up is critical. And those of us in the room who have been working on this topic for, 30 years, we, along with Paul Krauss, deserve a lot of thanks to each other and to Paul Krauss in particular as the historian who had the temerity to write about a strike that both the company and the union wanted to forget about. The union lost and took them, 40 years before we could get a contract with U.S. Steel, and the company, which had caused the murder of 10 people on the banks of the Monongahela right now, they did not want to be reminded. And so we are here to remind people, to remind our communities, to remind the world that the struggles of working people here in Homestead really presented a critical challenge to capital in our country and in the world. And a couple of little things I want to remind folks of, that when the union was challenged in 1892 by Frick to drop the union, by Frick and Carnegie to drop the union, it was their second contract. There had been union contracts for 6 years. 1886 was the first union contract before Carnegie bought the mill. And he was forced to sign in 1889 because of the strength of the union, and he made that promise that he was going to represent people and support the working class. Well, of course, then he hired Frick, the murderer from the coke ovens, right, to manage his mills. So it was a well-established union community that, and Charlie McCollister is going to talk about this with the NEH, that's his topic, which is to talk about how the mill towns and the unions were developed in that period. Well, it was against all odds. Remember, we did not have the right to organize until 1935, after struggle after struggle after struggle. The law was against us. It was you were considered to be an illegal conspirator when you brought people together to fight for rights, right? So it was a challenge at that time. And so, but they made it work here in Homestead. They challenged the law and they gained contracts, two 3-year contracts in a row. And that's how the struggle continues. We fight for each inch. Those of us involved in unions and those of us involved in social services of any kind. We're fighting for every inch, right? And we're still fighting, but if we forget about our victories of the past, it's hard to muster that energy, right, to fight for the future. Try to remember all those pieces that I want to bring up. It takes a lot of personal creativity and energy to do this stuff. But coming together, we form a kind of a barrier. We kind of form a group that we can fight together. We can remember this stuff. So when we came together in 1990 to start the commemoration for the centennial of the 1892 strike, there are a few of us in the room who remember that effort to pull these stories together. Nobody wanted to tell this story because it was difficult to tell. So when we gathered all of these newspaper clippings, as Joe White was showing us some of those newspaper clippings, we got what we could. There's more of the story to tell today. And Tammy's been doing this research on the Jewish community in Homestead. Butch and Tony I've been telling the story of black workers in Homestead in the steel industry. There's much more to tell. The references are difficult to find. Excuse me, working people often didn't have a photo taken of themselves in their entire life. Before 1935, working people could hardly afford bread, right? Before we had the unions, we didn't have the right really to represent ourselves. So digging up our histories is really hard. So what we've been doing in terms of our contribution to the NEA's teacher training is they've got a dozen experts coming in to talk. And four of us are members of the Battle of Homestead, and we're telling very different stories than the story of industry or the story of, see their titles. So the music, and there's really good stuff up there. The events of the homestead, it's not just the event, it's really the struggles. And so Charlie is going to be kind of going into like the story of the fact that John McLuckie was a union man. He was the Burgess or mayor of Homestead in 1892. He had a history from the Knights of Labor, from organizing in the coal mines, really previous to that. So he had a labor history. He was already a labor activist. He understood the struggles of working people. He understood that it was just as important for people to have water and gas, right? For people to have utilities. That people who didn't have that couldn't have enough time, because they were busy gathering wood or getting water, didn't have time to fight together, to make it better. So every bit, every inch of getting utilities into working class communities became a piece that helped us struggle for more, right? So that fight continues, I'm going to talk about, with the NEH, how we dared to take the scant information that we had about the strike and actually make a film about it, right? When Nicole Fauteur, my film partner for The River Ran Red, when we started putting this together, the Battle of Homestead had already produced a book, was producing a book, but we were trying to find the images. So we called David McCullough, you may know of him, he wrote the book about the Johnstown flood and many others. And when we called him, we didn't realize he was working on a film about Andrew Carnegie, the richest man in the world at the time. And he told us we couldn't tell that story because there weren't any images. So we looked, and in fact, he was right. There weren't any images. The moving pictures hadn't yet been developed. That happens in 1899. Very few pictures. The only pictures we had of individuals, we had one of McLuckie, one of O'Donnell, a couple of Berkman, because he became a little more famous, and Emma Goldman, but lots of Frick and lots of Carnegie and lots of their homes and palaces and artwork and whatnot. But working people's history, visual history, didn't exist, right? The homes were in rubble, the stories were disconnected. We had to invent, we hired artists. We kind of faked it till we made it, right? To tell the story of working people, you have to dig deeper. Sometimes you're creating it. So we took on that challenge. And another person who will be speaking from our group is Joel Waller, and he spent a lot of time in a similar vein thinking and writing about how do we commemorate these events? Where do we take that memory and share it as a community event like this? We have this important critical event 130 years ago, and it's our job as an organization to keep sending it out there, to keep reminding people, find new creative ways, whether it's paintings on the wall, which you're going to hear about more today, or banners or speeches or putting up a website, or we have many different creative ways to tell it, but he's been really studying how that commemoration happens and how do we then bring memory back into our community celebrations. And Tammy, of course, has just talked to you about her work and the critically important job of the new historians to dig deeper, find those communities that we didn't find. The River Ran Red is a film we celebrate, we're proud of it, but it doesn't tell a lot of the stories. It doesn't tell the story of Black workers. We were not successful in getting that information from the archives. We were not successful in weaving in that story. Now, and the story of Jews in Homestead is not part of the River Ran Red. So those stories are critical and important. And the Battle of Homestead's task, as we continue in the next years, is to keep the story of struggle alive throughout our communities, throughout our histories, and to strengthen the fabric of memory so that our stories of working people continue to be told. So, thank you.
Who creates solidarity? The workers. Who creates the solidarity? The workers. Absolutely. So now we have Maura Bainbridge. Thank goodness. She's of the new generation to continue the work of this committee forward for many, many years. We're so happy to have her. She works at the University of Pittsburgh, and she did her doctoral dissertation on the Battle of Homestead, as well as the Pullman strike in terms of how it's commemorated and the memorials and the monuments to it. So please welcome Maura Bainbridge, our future.
Hi, my name is Maura Bainbridge. I'm really honored to be speaking to you all today. Like Rosemary said, in 2019 I completed my PhD in anthropology, and for my dissertation I compared memorialization of labor conflict at 3 different sites in the United States. So the Pullman neighborhood of Chicago, Ludlow, Colorado, and then here at Homestead. I asked questions like, what are the narratives that surround each of these sites? How do material aspects, literatures, involved organizations, and museum exhibits shape the stories told? Why do people visit these sites, and what do they expect to find when they get there? I argued that the materials that remain at each site directly impact the heritage narratives of each location. As we know, here at the waterfront property, much equipment from the Homestead Works remains, but there's very few places where the narrative on signage and other markers speak explicitly about the labor of steelmaking, let alone the 1892 battle. The pump house, where we meet today, provides the rare example where labor conflict is discussed. Here, the blue Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission marker presents the key points of the battle, while the bronze broadside reproduces the Advisory Committee's 1892 address to the public. There are also 2 signs outside in the same style as others around the waterfront. The first, entitled Labor Struggle, further details the Battle of Homestead, explaining the arrival of 300 Pinkertons in Homestead as a threat to townspeople's livelihood. The other, called the Battle of Homestead, was installed in 2016, in part by the Battle of Homestead Foundation. The sign outlines the ongoing significance of the battle, locating the significance in this here pump house building. These signs are in stark contrast to ones like Armor for America at the press at the Lowe's parking lot, or Boosting Production near the gantry crane, which talk about the scale of World War II steel production, or the national icons built from Homestead steel, like Mike mentioned earlier, like the Empire State Building, the Sears Tower, St. Louis Gateway Arch. This signage, which an average home waterfront shopper might be more likely to encounter, foregrounds stories of American industrial progress and democracy. Those of us in this room understand how these neatly patriotic myths erase the contributions of working people, particularly as they fought for labor rights in the face of unfair and unsafe workplace conditions, oftentimes amidst ethnic and racial discrimination. Another piece of my research was the survey of visitors to each site, exploring why folks chose to visit and what they thought about while they were there. During the winter of 2018, I spoke to people outside of the pump house. The majority of visitors to the pump house that winter matched the demographics of most heritage sites. That is, they were mostly white, over 50, and retired. About 3/4 of the folks I spoke to were local to Homestead and had been to the site before. While over 85% of the visitors I spoke to were at the pump house to use the Steel Valley Trail, about half of the folks identified the history of the site as belonging to labor history, sometimes specifically naming the Battle of Homestead. Many explained the contemporary significance of the pump house as tied to labor history. Some drew connections to current events, and others identified a personal connection, either by familial link, a union or trade connection, or simply as growing up as Pittsburghers. This data brings me to why we're here today. Why 130 years later, the Battle of Homestead and labor history in general still matters. Working people today are part of the same struggles that workers fought and died for in 1892. Forgetting these stories and ignoring these connections allows obscene capital accumulation and worker exploitation to continue. When we maintain a people's history, we preserve a more complete and accurate historical record. We can not only be inspired by our collective potential, but also understand our responsibility to take action and create a more just world. Thanks.
Justice, the workers. And I will tell you, we got a worker among us now. Come on up here, Jennifer. Jennifer Rempel is the worker, the painter, the artist that created these phenomenal paintings of Mother Jones and Fanny Sellens. And you really need to take a few minutes to examine them because, as Steffi said, there's no images from 1892 about the workers. But Jennifer Rempel has created those imagery, and they are real, they are authentic, and they are, frankly, inspiring. Thank you, Jennifer. Jennifer Rempel, our artist in residence.
I am touched to see all my friends. It has been way too long, and I'm not a fan of Zoom, so sorry, but I love seeing your faces, and I love being in this building. I met you all first in this building when I had read in the newspaper, the Post-Gazette, that there was going to be a plaque installed commemorating this building. And I guess it's 2016 that happened. And an avid reader of the Post-Gazette, I read this, and coincidentally, I'm an artist, by the way. I'm an artist, and I make my living doing commissioned work. So one of my clients, a really good client, who was actually from Portland, Oregon, had an affinity for the Homestead strike. And she lived they had an apartment here downtown in a historic bank building. And I did a lot of painting for them. And I designed a folding screen that depicted the famous etching by, it's like Edwin Rao, I think it is. So it was just in the newspaper of the strike. And I painted it, and it's just all black and white, but I added color, and I also added some political cartoons from that era. And it was in their apartment downtown. So as it goes, I called in the paper to find out who these Battle of Homestead people were, and if they'd be interested in using my folding screen for the event. And they were, and I did, and the rest is history. So I got to meet these folks and got more connected with my love of history and connecting it to my own work, which I hadn't done before. So once I got caught up in the Pittsburgh history and the labor history. I then painted Mother Jones. And she basically traveled around the whole country fighting for the rights of workers. But she did speak here in Pittsburgh and was arrested here in Pittsburgh, and right here in Homestead, back in the day. And I mean, her story is remarkable. She was, I think she was an Irish immigrant and came here, I think lived in Tennessee, was married, and the yellow fever came through, killed all her 4 children and her husband. And she moved to Chicago, became a dressmaker to make a living, and then the Chicago fire hit. So she went through that. But she was such a feisty individual, and she actually comes from a history of people fighting for rights. I think her grandfather in Ireland was arrested or whatever, so it was in her blood. But I depicted her, she always wore black, I read, but I painted her in blue. She, being a dressmaker, was highly fashionable. So even though she was down in the trenches, she always looked good. And she never was short on words to say and tell people off or whatever. But you know, just what you were, Steffi was saying and people were saying about finding images. I found images, but they're very vague, very out of focus, a lot of the things that I found. And so I had to invent some things. And, but I did find these photographs that are, like you see through her dress, of workers in the mines, children, and working in the mines. And also her powerful hands, that this particular pose, which I kind of adjusted, a very good friend of mine who actually built this amazing frame for the painting has these beautiful working hands. So those are my friend Mary Jo's hands in the fist and holding the book, because they were too out of focus to even paint them. And I think that's the most powerful part of that painting, is the strong fist of this powerful woman who lived to be 100 years old. And stood up to, I was reading just recently about, you know, I guess like you said, they couldn't gather. It was illegal to gather. So anytime they would, you know, try to get people excited on the street, they would be arrested by the iron and coal police. And, but there is a plaque down where she spoke. And then she was arrested here in Homestead, spent a night in jail, and so many people gathered outside of the prison and they were afraid there was going to be a riot, that they actually released her. So then, well, I've actually started to work on a whole series of Pittsburgh women, and a few of them are not here because they're not labor connected, but I have a painting of the wonderful Betty Davis, who died just this past year in Homestead. And I have a painting of Rachel Carson, who basically started the environmental movement, who is also from Pittsburgh. And I have a painting of my very own grandmother, my Polish grandmother, who was an immigrant and marched with the suffragettes. And I learned of, this is Fanny Sellens, whose name I had never heard of before I met these wonderful folks. And she was a union organizer and fought for the rights, the workers' rights. And I learned that she had been assassinated in 1919 in Toronto. That she was actually trying to protect someone that was being beaten by the police. And I depicted her in prison because when she was imprisoned, and they put her in this prison that was just a man's prison, and she was just completely being heckled and harassed. And it also was unfit for a woman to be in these conditions. But you can see the way I depicted her, she's serene. She's not, she just has her books, she's doing her job, she's on a mission, and she was on a mission until, they killed her. But this photograph, this image is from a postcard that was put out at the time when she was imprisoned. And they, what do you call it? Like canvassed the White House and Woodrow Wilson to see if they could get her out of jail. And sure enough, I think it was Mrs. Wilson that helped to spring her. But they had in 2019, the people of Tarentum every year celebrate and commemorate what she had done there. And in 2019 was the 100th anniversary, and there was a wonderful event there in Tarentum. And that's when I did this painting for that. And you'll see if you come up close to it, it's pretty much just the exact postcard that I had the image of, but I depicted where you can see sort of in shadow is underneath her bed. It's the iron and coal police that basically killed her. So I depicted them as being like the monster under the bed. So I'm continuing to do more paintings, and it's great to see all you guys.
Thank you. Who's ready for bread versus two? Jennifer Engelberger. Hey, so now it's my treat to introduce our program chairwoman of our Battle of Homestead Foundation. If you've been tuning in to our Zoom programs, and you know what a quality product you're receiving in terms of labor education and labor celebration and labor commemoration. And it's because of the leadership of this fantastic woman, Suzanne Donsky, our program chair. Suzanne! Woo!
Rosemary, that were only true. Actually, the program committee is a fabulous group of very hardworking people. We meet way too frequently and discuss things in way too much minutia to get to where we are today. And I want to thank you. First of all, let me just say this personally. What an absolute joy it is to see people in person. You have no idea. Because we on the program committee have waited for this for a really long time, even as you were frustrated with the Zoom programs, and believe me, we were too. We hope that going forward, we can do sort of a dual thing, as this program today is being broadcast through Facebook Live, for example, because the upside to the pandemic, if there is one, is that we spread our reach much further. We have people in other countries watching our programs now, and we certainly don't want to abandon them. It is, after all, our goal to reach as many people as we can, to tell the story, to love the history, to live the history, and to encourage others to do the same. I have to tell you, I first heard about the Battle of Homestead Foundation through my husband, Bart Myers. I was working at the National Labor Relations Board, as Bart did for way a long time. And he was retired, and he'd be going off to his happy Wednesday morning breakfast at the Eaton Park, practically wagging his tail like a dog. He was going to see terrific people talking about important things. And I'd be trudging off on my commute and being very ornery about having to go to work, and even harassed John a few times for why we couldn't do daytime breakfast, nighttime breakfast, so other working people could go. And Bart would yell from the bed, "Don't let the bastards grind you down," and run off to his lovely breakfast. Well, and a few times I actually, shall we say, took some leave and came to breakfast too. And I knew then right away what the attraction was. So many super bright people also committed to justice in so many different places. And living again the history, making the history, loving it. And I found my place. So fast forward, I retired in 2019 and I dove headlong into volunteering for the organization. And some may say, why? And I say why is because I'm a true believer. And I think most of you here are true believers too. And that's believing in making the world, as Tammy Hepps said so beautifully, or John, I'm sorry, making the world a better place by studying, learning, and teaching others, spreading the word, interpreting what happened at the battle, but in so many different areas of historical study. One needn't be a scholar necessarily to love this. And that's me, lawyer, not scholar, but such meaning comes out of that study. And such meaning comes out of working with people for a common purpose. And as I said, I'm a true believer, that's why I do it. So my job here today is really super easy, because I'm a true believer. And that is, I'm gonna ask you for money. And volunteer hours. So I just did, and we could probably stop right there, but let me tell you, the pandemic took a hit on our money because we, by going to the Zoom for our programming, we're not realizing as much income as we need and as we hope for. And we need to boost those funds up again. And we have very specific purposes for them, which is increased quality programming and support of this archives project, which I feel like we're always talking about sort of, there's this fabulous archives project without putting it front and center, which is, this is what it's all about, the preservation, so that we can teach going forward. So we need money. You can give a one-time donation. We'd be so happy to talk to you about making a monthly contribution. It makes it easier for you. You can leave us all your money in your will. But we have a dream, which is to continue this mission of preserving and working toward bringing more people in who can understand what so many have said before me today, the significance of interpreting history for today so that we can understand what it is we're supposed to be doing in these really super confusing times. So I'm asking you, please, there's a pass-around jar, and we take checks. And there's a volunteer form. We take volunteers, and specifically, I'll just say this one thing. We're going to be looking for a membership chairperson. Not that hard of a job, but a super important job. Several of you have asked me this morning, like, I think I owe you dues, but I haven't paid them. So that membership chairperson will help us to create a good system going forward. And we are also going to be looking for someone to take over as program chair. There are other smaller volunteer opportunities. It could be making phone calls to people we haven't heard from in a long time and we're concerned about them and would like to see them join us for our programs. It could be helping set up for programs. There are so many possible paths, so many ways to help, and I hope you will consider it. Thank you.
Speaking of archives, I hope you all have a chance to check out, and I'd like to introduce Jacqui Cavalier, who's the chair of our archives committee.
Good morning, everyone. It's great to see everyone. I'm here.
It just hits. doesn't
I
it?
know. I think it's something with this microphone, maybe. It must be. I am so inspired and honored to be able to be part of this organization and to have so many inspirational people who I got to stand and listen to today. It is overwhelming and, again, so incredibly inspirational that we have all of these people who are available to us as mentors, and we can learn the true value of work and the contributions of those who came before us. When I was a small child, my dad handed me a leather folder, and he said, "Open it." And I opened it, and it was my grandfather's naturalization papers, who immigrated here from Italy in 1913. And I remember that folder. I have the folder today, but I remember how it smelled, and I remember how it felt, and I remember opening it and thinking about what was inside. And that began my love affair with archives and material culture and artifacts and the things that are available to us as an inheritance to be able to tell the stories of those who came before us, their struggles, their triumphs, and their lives. And so it is with tremendous joy that I am going to introduce the Archives Committee as well as members of our staff who are here today doing this work of preservation so that all of our stories and the stories of those who came before us will be available to those who come after us as an inheritance. I'd like to first of all introduce my co-chair of the Archives Committee, Mr. Perry Recker. Back. I want to introduce our staff, Sinead Bly, our Archives Project Advisor, who's not here with us today. Callie Sheets, one of our archives, who's not here with us today. But I am overjoyed to be able to introduce Cassidy Knott, and if Cassidy would please stand. Our archives administrator. She comes to us from Duquesne. She has been a tremendous asset and just a working machine when it comes to organizing and establishing the plan for carrying out this project. If you're not aware of the project, it really started very, very bare bones. We were lucky enough to receive a mini grant from the Rivers of Steel. We too, of course, specific to the archives, we are always looking for grant opportunities because it's the reliance on grants that is going to be able to see this through until we do receive, Suzanne, that huge endowment for the archives. I also want to introduce our other committee members, Mark Fallon, who one of his collections, you can see some of his items here today. John Haer, of course, one of our guiding forces. Jay Warnack, Charlie McAllister, who is, Jay's in the back, I didn't see you, Jay, I'm sorry, Jay. Charlie McAllister, who is not here, his collection is part of our archives. Connie Portis, who has been a tremendous resource with respect to opportunities in the community. Mike Stout, who of course is his collection is part of our acquisition as well. And our one and only Rosemary Trump. I apologize if I miss anyone. But do know that we are really moving forward and progressing with this project. We have the opportunity for some new acquisitions that are possibly coming our way. We're challenged in terms of space right now, so we're reconsidering those other opportunities for enlarging our space, including workspace and storage space. As you all know, having, climate control and heavy security and so on and so forth is paramount to any archives project, of course. We are also looking at increasing our staff over the summer by bringing on possibly 2 new interns who will be working with Cassidy directly. So I invite you all to please take some opportunity. This is a very small mini exhibit, but we are looking at continuing the work and being able to enlarge the exhibit to ultimately we'll get to the point of perhaps having a permanent space to aid and help with this ongoing important story and education. So thank you all, and thank you, Cassidy, for all the great work that you do.
Like on our Zooms, there's a little bit of time if anyone would like to raise a question or a comment so far. Yeah, Joe. You want to come up, Joe, and speak? Joe has a real people's history story to tell.
Well, I do. It's about people. Brings it back. We talked about the struggle between labor and capital for hundreds of years. I just want to bring it back for a minute to July 6, 1892. In Lower Borough, 25 miles from here, lies George Rutter, one of the workers shot. I went up to visit his grave yesterday, left a couple flowers, and you can see it brings it back to an individual. I see his tombstone. He was a soldier in the Union Army as a teenager. On his right, there's a woman, probably his wife, who was born a year later than him. On the left, there's a tombstone. Died the same year he did, 1892. Could have been a wife or a mother. So these aren't just names in history books. This was a living human being. I live several miles from there, and I did leave flowers, and I stopped there once in a while. But I just wanted to bring it back to the day we're celebrating here.
Yes, sir. Yes, you may. Thank you. Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. Good afternoon, everyone. I just wanted to bring you greetings from the Borough of Homestead. I'm John Burwell, the Mayor of Homestead. And I wanted to make sure that I came here because of the history of my family as well. Homestead was chartered in 1888, and my family came from Virginia, my great-grandfather, and they came here to work in the steel mill. I'm trying to find some pictures myself as well. And my grandfather was born here in Homestead in 1904. So my family goes way back, and I also wanted to volunteer because I believe that you have to give back. And I just want to say thank you so much for having this. I just wish a lot of other people would have known, even the African American residents of Homestead would have known this was here, so we can, also share in some of these triumphs that we have done. So I say that however you can use me, I'm here for you. Thank you.
Okay, let's hear from Mike and Jason.
For those of us that worked at the Homestead Mill, the Battle of Homestead wasn't just 1892. The Battle of Homestead was 1886 to 1986, and it went on for 100 years. And we won some battles, we lost some battles, and the only way they could defeat us was to tear that mill down. That's the only reason they won. And for those of you that, when Joe White was talking about my book, which has a history of Homestead, but mainly the last 10 years. There's a picture on the front of my book with hundreds of people giving the finger. And when the PM Press decided to publish the book, they asked me to send them pictures, and I sent them about 10 pictures, and you know, I thought they were going to want to put pictures of the mill and blah, 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 and they went, no, put that picture with the people giving the finger on the front cover. And April 6, 1983, in my opinion, was one of the best demonstrations of the thousands I've been to. April 6, 1983, Ronald Reagan came to Pittsburgh, and 4,000 steelworkers showed up downtown. And when he went inside the Hilton Hotel, he was in there and we were marching around, and then the word went out that he was getting ready to leave the Hilton. The 4,000 people rushed the front door of the Hilton, and everybody, all 4,000 of us started giving the finger, and our chant was "Screw Nancy, not the workers." And it was so hostile that Ronald Reagan had to slip out under the basement, through the tunnels, through a gateway to get out and to get away from the steelworkers. But I want you to know something. Anybody that knows me, anybody that's listened to my music, you know where I stand. I stand with the downtrodden, I stand with the oppressed, and I stand with those who make history. And I want everybody here to know that my name might be on that book, but that book was done by a collection of people. It wasn't just done by Mike Stout. The Women in Steel section was written with Steffi Domike, Carolyn Greenwich, Jamie Greenwich. The African American section was written with John Presley, who still works at the Urban Works, but worked at Homestead, and with African American workers. The unemployed section was written with Barney Osler. That book is a collective effort to show the history of resistance and the history of struggle and the history of where this organization stands. And that's with the downtrodden, with the oppressed, and with the working class. And this song goes out to all of you.
Once I was a molder,
check out